Hi friends. This week we are talking about Ruth and Boaz in our study called Woven. And this is a story that some people are super unfamiliar with or maybe kind of have some recollection about from when they were younger. But I love this story not only because it's a beautiful love story, but because it completely reveals God's heart to us, his heart to provide, to rescue, and to redeem. And I literally, when I was getting ready for this week, I just had to stop and praise God for his goodness and his sovereignty. I just was in such awe of who he is as a result of this study, or of this particular story. So I hope that is a little bit contagious for you today as you listen. So our three divisions for today are number one, times of crisis, number two, as it turns out, and number three, our Kinsmen Redeemer. So I'm going to pick up reading the first couple of verses in Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and so Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So our story this week picks up only actually one generation after last week's lesson. Remember when we talked about the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua? And you might remember the part of the story where God's rescue included Rahab, the prostitute. And we actually ended last week's lesson learning that Rahab had been spared and welcomed into God's family of people, but in fact, she wasn't only spared, she ended up marrying a prince of Judah, and she had a son, and they named their son Boaz, who we will meet in our current story shortly. So at the beginning of the book of Ruth, we learn about Elimelech and Naomi, who were part of the Israelite community, and they lived in Jerusalem. But there was a famine in the land, and so Elimelech, whose name actually literally means God is king, takes his family and moves them outside the promised land to a city called Moab. And so at first glance, this plan seems kind of reasonable. You know, there's a famine and their family needed food. But when you look at other references in the Bible to the city of Moab, we quickly realize that Elimelech was not making decisions for his family which were consistent with his name at all. Instead of seeing God as king and trusting him to provide, Elimelech moved his family away from the protection and support of community and extended family. And he actually moved them to a pagan nation, which was known for seducing God's people away from their devotion to God. In fact, if you want to learn about the beginnings of Moab, you should read in Genesis 19. There's a few stories in that chapter which are kind of disturbing, and they point out, remember a few weeks ago we talked about how God saw the people of Noah's day and they were only evil all the time? Well, things didn't get a whole heck of a lot better, and in Genesis chapter 19, we see God's response in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Lot, who was Abraham's brother, had settled in an ungodly place, and it had terrible ramifications for his family. And it actually also led to the beginning of Moab. Kind of interesting. But if you fast forward to Numbers 25, We read that in the 40 years that the Israelites spent wandering in the desert, they did spend some time in Moab. And what happened while they were there? Well, it says that while Israel was staying in Moab, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who in turn invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. Of course it did. God was like, "What are you doing, my people? I am the only true God. Don't worship anything else." So there was nothing particularly wise about Elimelech's move to Moab, but that doesn't mean that God won't use that decision for good. But while they are there, all three men in the family pass away. This left Naomi and her daughters-in-law in a very precarious position. There was no extended family to provide support or provisions. And in those days, being a childless widow, you can imagine, was like among the most disadvantaged classes of society. They were fully dependent on the generosity of others to provide for them. So this was a crisis for Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. Side note, Orpah, it's not Oprah. It's kind of tempting for us to read it Oprah. I read somewhere that Oprah's given name on her birth certificate was actually Orpah, after this character in the Bible. But because people kept mispronouncing it, they decided to just change it to Oprah. So if that's true, it's kind of fun and an interesting little fact. But we see in the midst of this crisis that Naomi has the inclination, however kind of half-hearted and broken that it is, to return to the promised land, back to her people and back to her God. Remember how a couple of weeks ago when we were learning about Moses, we saw that Moses had the inclination of the heart to serve and honor God. And God saw that as beautiful. Just like he sees it as beautiful when we choose to draw near to him, especially in times of crisis, rather than push him away. So Naomi tries to get her daughter-in-laws to return home to their families because she says, I have nothing to give you. I wonder if anyone else just loved this part of the story. How loving a mother-in-law must Naomi have been that neither of her daughter-in-laws wanted to leave her. They were crying out. They didn't want to leave her. Orpah eventually did return to her family, but Ruth, it says Ruth clung to her. And that term clung to her is actually the same word as cleave that's used in Genesis chapter 2, which means to hold fast out of commitment. And I think I love this so much because I love my own mother-in-law like this. The morning after Tony proposed to me, my mother-in-law woke me up and she's so sweet. She said, I was at their lake house and she woke me up. She said, "Good morning, daughter." And ever since then, she has truly treated me just like she treats her true daughter. And I just think having a relationship like that is such a blessing. And there's nothing I wouldn't do for her. In fact, my mother-in-law, who some of you may know, she's been to our Bible study a few times, she has a podcast called She Is Becoming. And I really recommend it. It's a podcast that she does with another younger woman, and they kind of bounce their wisdom off of each other and do really interesting interviews. It's very good. Anyway, she had told me she had just discussed the book of Ruth and the characters within the story on their podcast. So you should maybe tune in and give it a listen. And I love that in it, because I did take the time to listen, obviously getting prepared for this, I wanted to hear what they had to say. She shared how her relationship with her mother-in-law was such a blessing. And I knew that, but I had kind of forgotten. And how she had been so intentional to try to replicate that and be a blessing now to me and my sister-in-law, Melissa. And she has really succeeded. And now we have the opportunity, hopefully Melissa and I will each have 3 daughter-in-laws someday, that we will be able to make that same faithful decision to bless the next generation the way that we've been blessed. So I think that's why I love that part of this story so much. But listen to this most beautiful statement that Ruth makes to Naomi. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Is that not such a beautiful commitment? Not only is Ruth completely committed to Naomi, we see that even in the midst of this crisis they were facing, Ruth had this inclination of turning toward Naomi's God and trusting that there would be good in store for them as they set out to do life together. And I just think that's remarkable faith. It was a true statement of faith, in fact, and God always honors our faith. And Ruth didn't get stuck in self-pity about where they found themselves, which Naomi actually did for a period here. Remember, she says, instead of calling me Naomi, her name actually means pleasant, and she goes home and she says, instead of calling me Naomi, I want you to call me Mara, because the Lord has made my life very bitter. And I think the thing that's so interesting to note here is that Naomi was so busy looking at and being consumed by her loss, which is easy to understand because it was such significant loss. But she was consumed by it to the point where she wasn't able to focus on or see the amazing blessing that God was providing for her in this remarkable relationship with Ruth. And of course, she couldn't have known how God was going to provide for the whole world through what happened next. But before we move on to our second division, I think it would be good for us to take a minute to consider what we do when crisis strikes. None of us are exempt. Our crises will look different from one another. But Jesus said to us, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart because I've overcome the world." There is hope beyond what we are facing today. So when trouble does arise, what is your response? Is it to turn farther away from God in anger? Is it to turn slightly toward God, but to also hold on to resentment about what He's allowing? Or are you moving more toward Ruth's response of confidently trusting that God will provide and help, even though you have no idea how He might do that? Proverbs 3:5-6, a lot of us know this one. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." That means a lot of times we won't have understanding. We won't have the answers. But it says, "In all your ways acknowledge God, and He will make your path straight." And so I pray that God will give us this kind of trust in Him as we continue to study His Word, that we will know His heart more and more and be able to trust unswervingly in His goodness and His ability to help us. And not only do I pray that we will grow to have this type of trust in Him no matter what, I also pray that we will become women who have eyes to see the blessings that He is pouring out in the here and now, right in front of us. Look for these during hard times. God is so willing to show us how present He is and how much He loves us. So let's keep our eyes open for the blessings that He is pouring out. Okay, our second division is "As it turns out." I'm going to pick up reading in Ruth chapter 2. It says, "Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I might find favor.' Naomi said to her, 'Go ahead, my daughter.' So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. 'The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you,' they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." So you read in your faith work this week about how God, in his wisdom and goodness, set up a sort of social service program among his people to provide for the poor in the community. And this was a good program for both the farmers as well as the poor. It was good for the farmers because it really helped them to remember to be charitable with all that they had been given, to remember that what they had been given is a gift from God and it should be shared. And then it was good for the poor because it gave them a way to provide for themselves with some dignity. You know, God could have said to the farmers, "Deliver the excess of what you have to the homes of the poor in your community," but he didn't say that. The people knew that God was providing for them by the way that he asked his people to live. And that remains true today. God asks those of us to whom he's given much and in abundance to look out for the needs of others and to share with those who have less. And not only does that bless those in need, it blesses those of us who have extra to share because it protects us from greed and it reminds us everything we have is a gift that should be shared. That's how good and wise God is. It blesses both the giver and the receiver. So we see Ruth sets out to do something about these dire circumstances she and Naomi find themselves in. And she gets to work. She knew about God's provision and how he allowed for people to go in and glean after the harvesters had passed through. And she was hoping she would find favor in someone's eyes. And as it turned out, she happened to pick the field of the relative of Elimelech. Coincidence? Not a chance. And from the start, we see that Boaz is a man of standing. Some translations say that that meant he was a rich man, a man of prominence. And it's important to note that he was from the family of Elimelech that made him a kinsman. We also see that he was a man of character in the way that he interacted with those who were in service to him. He greeted them with honor, and he did the same with Ruth, even though she was a foreigner. Boaz was generous with his provision to Ruth and to Naomi, and he did not take advantage of Ruth. You know, he even ordered the people that worked for him to watch over her and to not to touch her. Can we just pause for a second and remember that Boaz was Rahab's son? Rahab the prostitute. How completely encouraging. I get goosebumps when I think about it. That no matter where we came from, God can redirect the course of our lives and enable us to raise up a next generation of God-honoring and God-loving children. That's deeply encouraging to me. And not only was Boaz's character notable, but Ruth's was as well. I'm going to pick up reading a couple more verses in chapter 2. This is Boaz speaking to Ruth. He says, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." You know, truly, Ruth was taking refuge in the Lord. She was in a place of needing security and needing God to provide. And so I hope that you enjoyed reading some of the verses in our faith work, which talked about taking shelter under the wings of the Lord. I particularly liked the quote in Matthew 23 that was Jesus speaking, where he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I've wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. This tells us God wants us to be willing to take shelter in him and to trust his loving provision for our lives. So our story goes on where Naomi suggests a plan to Ruth, who obediently follows through. Naomi told Ruth that Boaz was one of their kinsmen redeemers, which is a family member who was considered obligated by Israelite law to rescue Ruth out of her dire circumstances. So we are going to talk a little bit more about the kinsman redeemer next, because it is such a beautiful foreshadowing of what Jesus came to do for us. So back to the plan. Ruth approaches Boaz after he's asleep on the threshing floor, which I learned that he was doing in order to protect the harvest. And Ruth lays down at Boaz's feet. Now and Naomi's like, don't forget to uncover his feet. We're left going, what does this even mean? Some people thought, is this like a provocative, kind of inappropriate, suggestive act? Well, in fact, it was not. Ruth laying down at Boaz's feet was an act of complete submission. And actually, when he awakes, she boldly, essentially proposes marriage, which is kind of interesting. My best guess about the uncovered feet was that I wake up if my feet are cold. So maybe she thought he'd be more likely to wake up and notice that she was down there if Ruth had uncovered his feet. I don't know, but I'm going to pick up reading now in chapter 3, verse 8. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant, Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning and rest. So by asking Boaz to spread the corner of his garment over her, Ruth was asking to take refuge in him, asking him to be her security and to provide for her according to the law that God gave. And I just love Boaz's response. He did not see this as a burden. He saw her request as kindness to him. She could have gone after younger men, but she was drawn to the kind of man that Boaz was. So Boaz goes off to see if this other kinsman redeemer would fulfill the role to both Ruth and Naomi. This must have been kind of a nail-biting situation, because who knows how it would turn out, and Ruth had her heart set on Boaz. But he had to do things the right and upstanding way. And we read that Boaz approached the other kinsman redeemer, who remains unnamed, which is awfully merciful, because it was considered pretty poor form to turn down the kinsman redeemer obligations. And they met at the city gate where the legal matters of the day were handled. So not only did this situation require that the land of Elimelech be redeemed, but that his son's wife be taken in marriage to maintain his name among God's people. The other man was not able to fully redeem this situation. I think he thought the land seemed kind of interesting, but when he realized that it came with the obligation to take a wife, he backed off. Maybe he had a wife, and maybe that wife was like, no way, are we having more wives around? You can't really blame her. So Boaz agreed to fully redeem Ruth's, and by default, Naomi's dire circumstance. And he happily takes Ruth, a woman of noble character, as his wife, and they have a son whom they named Obed. which means servant. And I just love that because servant, as Ann Voskamp pointed out, is what Ruth made herself to Boaz, and Boaz made himself to Ruth. Boaz served Ruth by honoring her and then being willing to provide for her every need. What a beautiful picture of what dating and then marriage is supposed to look like. And as we each seek to become more like Jesus, it would be helpful for us to remember that Jesus himself said that he did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that leads us nicely to our third division, which is our Kinsmen Redeemer. I really hope that you are starting to see the parallels between Boaz and Jesus, and how the portrait of Boaz is such a picture of God's love for us. To give a little bit more background, I think you're going to like this. According to Deuteronomy, one of the guidelines that God gave to the people through Moses was this provision of a kinsman redeemer, or a goel. And the role of this person was multifaceted. The closest relative was more or less obligated to buy back property of a deceased relative. This person was also supposed to step in and avenge the death of a relative that may have been murdered. So this person is an avenger. They were also responsible to deliver their relative from dire circumstances, rescue from slavery, and in many cases asked to marry the widow of the deceased in order to carry on their name. What provision! Isn't that amazing? In fact, the Bible actually says that if the kinsman redeemer refused to take the woman as his wife, she could take his sandal, so he goes home with one shoe, and she could spit in his face publicly. It actually says that. But that didn't happen in this story because Ruth and Boaz wanted to be with one another. She didn't want the other kinsman redeemer. So it was a happy ending, and we all love a happy ending, and it required no spitting. So that was good too. Boaz fulfilled the Mosaic law fully. He redeemed the land owned by Ruth's father-in-law. He rescued Ruth and Naomi, and he made Ruth his bride. Poor Ruth, the widow who had no security, came under the shelter of her kinsman redeemer and became the rich bride of Boaz. Similarly, Jesus, who came to fulfill the law, remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about how he said he came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. Jesus offers us what Boaz offered Ruth. He offers us security. He welcomes the foreigner, that's us, into his family. He rescues us from our slavery to sin, from our dire circumstances, and he gives us his very name to be known as his forever. Isaiah 54:5 says that the Lord Almighty is our true husband. And that might seem a little confusing if that's the first time you're hearing that, but that is the kind of commitment that God makes to us. The kind of love and commitment that a husband makes to his wife, to care for her, to treasure her, to meet her every need. Oh, love this. And just like Ruth, who was told to rest while Boaz did the work of redeeming, you and I get to rest in the finished work of Christ on the cross, which made us his forever, fully accepted and forever loved. And as we close, I think it's worth noting that the decision that Naomi made all those years ago, even in her weakness and in her brokenness, to return to God, to return to the land that he provided, had direct impact on each of our lives today. Because had she not had that inclination of the heart to turn toward God, despite her confusing and heartbreaking situation, Ruth most likely would not have turned in faith to her God as well. And just like God saw and rescued and included Rahab in his family lineage, God did the same for Ruth. Obed, Ruth's son, eventually became King David's grandfather, and we know that Jesus descended from King David. More about him next week, but if you think about it, had that famine not ever happened, Elimelech and his family may never had left for Moab, and Ruth would not have had the opportunity to be grafted into God's family. Do you see how God can use all things for good? So no matter what you are facing today, I pray that your hope in the sovereignty and goodness of God has been renewed today. He never wastes what we go through. And he is at work behind the scenes in ways that we can't imagine. Even in mistakes maybe that we have made, he is able to work for the good. So stay on your knees in dependence on God. Ask him in this season, Lord, what would you have me learn from this time in my life? Help me to learn what I need to know. And you never know the powerful impact that your heart of faith, your inclination to turn toward God in your hard circumstances and draw near to him may have on the generations to come. We know the answer is never going farther from God. In fact, if you found that you have wandered away, he is always ready and watching to receive you back and restore you to himself. And if you find yourself in a seemingly impossible or especially discouraging situation, and you just don't see how God could possibly use this for good or come through, I want you to remind yourself about how God was at work in this story of the book of Ruth behind the scenes, and how he orchestrated all these circumstances so that his heart could be revealed and that his purposes would prevail. Because I know he's doing the very same thing for you. So let's pray. Lord, we do acknowledge your goodness and your sovereignty. We do not pretend to understand your ways, but we do want to humble ourselves before you. Just because we may not be able to think of a reason for what we're facing doesn't mean that there isn't one. Give us eyes of faith to see how you are providing today. Help us to trust that you will be at work for our good day after day. Help us to learn in this lesson what you want us to know. And we thank you for being our true Kinsmen Redeemer, who rescued us fully from our dire circumstances and slavery to sin. Thank you so much, God, that means we get to live a life, a free life, both now and for eternity. We love you, Father. Amen.